Yeah, welcome everyone to what I think is going to be an extraordinary evening. And the essential provocation, I think, is going to be particularly pertinent to some of us who are working on the kind of coalface of reality. So I wouldn't say more than that, but I really look forward, as I know we all do, to hearing you, Peter, and thank you so much for coming. And adding to this seminar series, this is the second, following Alberto Perez Gomez, which was rather wonderful. That was upstairs because of the question of screen and talk. We are having it down here, and I have drawn a kind of a curtain in front of what is a provocative building, our tall building in the City of London, in order that Peter doesn't have to be embarrassed in his views, whatever they may be. I have no idea. But anyway, so with that, without any further ado, Peter, thank you.
Eric, thank you. It's very sweet. This owes a big debt to many of the people in the audience, so I hope I haven't abused your gift. I've boiled this down from an hour and a half to 45 minutes, so I hope it's comprehensible. And it's very much a work in progress, so if something occurs to you that's objectionable, worth including, please let me know. Okay. I think we should thank Alberto first for the succinct and poignant summary of the Western tradition that he gave, 2-3 weeks ago. Yet, since the advent of secular culture and the thematization of tradition as a concept in early German Romanticism, subsequently augmented by the long contest with technology, roughly from the time of Ruskin, tradition has acquired an aura of a profound ideal in need of rescuing or rehabilitation. To be sure, it's inherent in human finitude to be remote from the highest good. And of course, heavenly Jerusalem marks the end of time. That's heavenly Jerusalem at the top, according to Bosch. However, it must also be acknowledged that in Europe, that tradition was for several centuries the context for praxis, whereas praxis now prevails in a condition of conflict between our fractious materialist culture and the ethical symbolism of the tradition. So it's a conflict of both content and the styles of thought. Not entirely, of course, and Dalibor's negotiation with positive and negative fragments fairly characterizes current procedure. Stimulated by investigations in other cultures, by trying to figure out what people mean by intelligence, by questions like, what does the up stand for in the expression bottom up? And above all, by the question of embodiment, I've been exploring contexts. These, after all, provide us with our moral orientation, and therefore the decorum, which, since Vitruvius, has been the basis for good in architecture. A context can be quite intimate, like this tête-à-tête by Vuillard, or it could potentially be almost everything. I mean, I still haven't figured out why, with the efficiency and beauty of the way ecology, works, why we need 14 billion light years of stars, galaxy, and dark matter just to have this conversation. But that's a mystery to me. Ultimate background. Context is hardly a single substance, as it comprises phenomena ranging from material configurations like habitats and architecture to conventions, customs, institutions, and languages. One is always inside a context, and conversely, one is always part of everybody else's context. I'm going to use the term broadly to connote the conditions for freedom of individuals, groups, or societies, or indeed non-human species. A plant won't grow anywhere. If the basic question is the relation of the individual to the rest of reality, this brings us to a tension between, on the one hand, the relation between the particular and the universal, usually expressed symbolically, and on the other hand, the particular and the general, largely a conceptual exercise of classification, like a topology. Contexts are experienced as if they were always already there, but they can be created or modified, incurring an important element of responsibility. That's the freedom for in my title. Contexts have always involved conflict. Gadamer's profound rendering of tradition omits the body count by which it was achieved, but he's right to observe the ancient Greek creativity of making conflict the basis of understanding through dialogue. That is to say, the agon enacted in the making and judging of laws, in religious sacrifice, Greek tragedy, philosophical dialectic. Reacting against the reification of tradition by the fascist and Nazi regimes, Ernesto Grassi drew on Gadamer to argue that the attendant civic rhetorical practices are in fact the matrix for the renewal of the tradition through critique and reinterpretation. For the most part, I'll be speaking of cities, and it's useful to be reminded that it was once possible to think of urban renewal as renovatio urbis, on which Nick, who's here somewhere, has written a wonderful book. That is to say, the combination of infrastructural work, hospitals, roads, ports, canals, and the commissioning of festivals, plays, poems, art, so on and so forth. The practice conceives of city as a framework for cultural reorientation, which is hopeful, even if limited to the princes and priests of the oligarchies in the context of the nascent republicanism. That said, would it be that our own oligarchs had such imaginations? I don't see anything like this coming from the tech bros. As I mentioned in the beginning, one is always inside a context, which is therefore deeply implicated in the mystery of embodiment. The embodying conditions or artifacts or images do not have their properties intrinsically, but only when involved with the imaginations, the needs, the confusions, and so forth of people. We generally operate with two senses of embodiment, one having to do with the centrality of the body to our involvements in the world, and the other a more general aspect of particularly Western representation, which, as Heidegger put it, there prevails a strife between the potential of world and the embodying earth, translating Aristotle's nomos, law or custom, as an interpretation of physis, nature. A conventional sense of what this looks like is visible in the concluding section of Hegel's introductory lectures on aesthetics, where he considers the general types of art, which can, for him, constitute the self-unfolding of the ideal as the true idea of beauty. He ranks them in ascending order, from architecture to sculpture to painting to music to poetry. Poetry is dependent upon sensuous manifestation, so not yet philosophy, but is made the apex of the schema because the artistic imagination, fantasia, is its proper medium, and imagination is essential to every product that belongs to the beautiful. No, I'm not going to get into the self-realization of the absolute idea and all of that. You'll be happy to hear. Hegel's schema is part of a long history where, in general, the bottom row embodies the top row. Eugen Fink, who was a close mate of Heidegger and Gadamer, in his book Play as Symbol of World, refers to, quote, this interpretation of the human essence that determines the image of human being in Western metaphysics, which indeed operates with the fundamental distinctions between the sensible world and the intellectual world, the mundus sensibilis and the mundus intelligibilis, and determines the place of human being on the dividing line of both worlds, i.e. part animal, part God. Until phenomenology, the highest value was attached to the top row. Dalibor's insight, the city is a kind of topography of culture, was one of the key points of departure for what follows. Having grown up with that approximate understanding of reality, I was intrigued to discover among some non-Western cultures a systematic alternative to the ontology with which I was familiar. You will undoubtedly recognize this sort of diagram of the Neoplatonic universe where God instructs Mother Nature, to whom is chained the icon of mimesis, the monkey, who creates the harmonic universe laid out as a geometric figure. This is one of many of such things. This probably isn't known to you, and I'm just going to give you a very raw sketch of what it is. It's the end of 18 pages describing a sequence of rituals that come with the new fire ceremony, which is held at every 52 years when the 3 cycles of the Mesoamerican way of telling time return to an origin. It's built around an exchange between Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca, who are kind of reciprocal opposites of each other, one having to do with light and wisdom, the other having to do with the earth and the night. The whole sequence involves Quetzalcoatl. Take my word for it, he's being boiled in a pot here on a jade hearth that culminates in this new fire ceremony that is after the heart of Xiuhtecuhtli, who is a god of of fire and time. A fire is built in the chest cavity, which replicates what happens in an actual New Year's ceremony that the Aztecs conduct, which we can deal with another time. What's interesting about this to me is the notion of these opposites. So the species of a world is given in which everything is simply present as it happens versus a cosmos. When I speak here of an embedded language, take for example the example of the panther in Mayan iconography. You have the real panther with his nasty ways in the jungle. Panther as icon for ruler, so it can be, his hide can be the couch on which he sits, or something he wears in dances or in war. It can appear on temples, on pots, on censers, i.e. with these elaborate censers that are stacked with iconography. As in the glyphs, his balam, he both plays with rulership as a logogram, that's the head, is also a syllable, is also a sound, and has a grammatical value. So perhaps you get the idea of the way language is embedded. It isn't separate like our logos and physis. It's something embedded in everything you run across. Similarly, it's the plurality of non-hierarchical meanings are disclosed through analogies, rites, and narration, rather than through the rational organization through theology, philosophy, or theory. Now, we could go on and on, but take that much as what I'm interested in. That is to say, I believe that this holds a clue to, I think it has first of all, I think it characterizes an immense amount of daily life, and secondly, holds something informative for phenomenology. And so this is going to be built around 3 themes: the metaphoricity of involvement, relational poetics, and the problem of immanence and transcendence that's automatically raised by the confrontation of those 2 notions of order, senses of reality. It begins with this question: why aren't we disoriented by the eclectic, fragmentary, and composite configurations that accumulate in our cities, or alternatively by the purified emptiness that we tend to make for public space that Glissant characterized as well-phrased classicism, lukewarm humanism, colorless, and reassuring? The key to that is in Merleau-Ponty's notion of the impossibility of an ontological void. What I'm speaking about here is what Husserl calls the natural attitude. And the question is how our natural attitude is so bloody clever. My point of departure for this is built around the importance of analogy. Here, modalities of table, including water table, and so forth. We don't become involved with people or things the way a computer would render them, as objects plus characteristics, or as art history used to have it, as form and content. People and things make claims upon us as topics, with references both particular and cultural. All our involvements are fundamentally metaphoric. Moreover, our involvements are fraught with ambiguity, in which memories, fantasies, desires, prejudices, deceptions, partial or wrong understandings are all in play. With higher intelligence, i.e. above the animals and the plants, comes a greater propensity for error, ambiguity, confusion. Metaphor spent most of its life as a phenomenon of rhetoric, from Aristotle to Kant, a mark of genius. Any genius comes from the quality of the metaphor. Its presence is ubiquitous. As I've said, in architecture, it can't be avoided. Metaphor identifies a kind of direction of meaning. Is it, as it were, approximately right? Since Tesoro, its more recent implication in our perception or orientation in reality dates from Lakoff and Johnson's Metaphors We Live By, supporting the contention of Gadamer and Incur that metaphor underwrites both poetics and logic. Interestingly, this is how large language models attempt to approximate the work of metaphor. In what they call a relational database, all the words that are part of it are assigned vectors, which correspond, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's in order so that it can be computable. These are intended to resolve the semantic gap between how a computer stores data and how things mean to us. The vectors are largely a matter of similarity coming from the training database. They speak of dimensions since they can be, there are a host of qualities. So if I'm looking for city, if there's a quality in my database that has to do with urban, it will get, a very high probability. If also among my qualities is aqueous, it'll get a low figure. And the number of dimensions in the database, well, GPT-3 had 12,288 dimensions. And this is some guy's attempt to register 13,000 dimensions in 2D. So you end up, you're not likely to find a cat here, but you'll find a lot of them here, kind of thing. Okay, you get the basic idea. Interesting to me is that's not wholly different from the way architects use typology, and particularly as the kind of database that feeds, the hotel room. Now, this doesn't exhaust typology, and again, this is part of being hasty. And if typology generally is good as a record of experience, and accordingly the results are plausible, it's also flat, a kind of statistical average. It's market safe. When we know just taking a bed, let alone the whole bedroom, you're invoking worlds with really quite profound and extreme traditions behind them. And this allows somebody who thinks metaphorically, like Le Corbusier, to, for example, do the bed in the Villa Chaudin, which is in the back of the image here, up in the roof, taking the convention of sleeping in the roof for cool weather and inscribing it within his horizons, the natural horizon and the spiritual horizon, or the horizon across which he invented it, this kind of creative angel meets the legs of the hermaphroditic couple, who are birds, who give birth to a soul above the horizon. Le Corbusier using alchemical imagery as a kind of surrogate for having an embodied shared culture. Interesting topic on its own. And similarly, we have the kind of stuff that we know from, say, Aldo Rossi, where the typicality of situations allows a seminar room to be good for a performance, a workshop, dining, a dance, or whatever. And a whole house can resonate with a club, a 19th century bordello, a law firm, or a doctor's surgery. Or you can combine restaurant and theater to arrive at cabaret, which will then influence theater and even agitprop. Okay, just a reminder, you're more familiar with all of that than me. Okay, relational order. The first level, basic level of relational order, was already spotted by Leibniz in his letters to Clarke. From two of his letters, he says that space is nothing else but that order of relation, and it is nothing at all without bodies and the possibility of placing them. Another one of his letters, 2 letters later, in fact. I have demonstrated that space is nothing else but an order of the existence of things, observed as existing together. That is, space and time are not autonomous creations of God, but come with the bodies, arise from the relation of bodies. Now, what's interesting to me is that formal difference here is pretty uninformative. Once I tell you that's a plate and that's a book, this becomes, coffee or tea, this becomes wine. The content is crucial. It's on the basis of content that we're not confused by something like this. We don't see the abstract shapes, but readily read the visual puns. And if anybody can think of a better French pun, I think it comes from Le Petit Journal, and I think this may come from the Eric Satie, 3 morsels in the form of a pear, but I'm not sure. At any rate, if anybody's got a better idea, I'd be grateful. In general, we're far more intelligent in our life praxis than we are able to describe, as we just said, the natural attitude. And as we are constantly reminded by the limitations of the computational or algorithmic metaphor for thinking. The regular appearance in phenomenology of expressions like experience of something, perception of something, calls attention to the significance of the something, which potentially comprises the whole culture. Accordingly, and somewhat inspired by ancient cosmologies, for whom the fundamental natural conditions were primary and human affairs secondary, I began to wonder if the subject's being in the world should not be understood as a derived phenomenon, whereas most people start with that as a point of departure. And I began replacing experience of and perception of with involvement with, in order to acknowledge the claims of our contexts. To me, this expression has 2 advantages. Firstly, it has a dialogical quality, more vividly extending intersubjectivity to the claims and affordances of a context. I'm sorry, this is where I left out McGilchrist. The second advantage of involvement with is that it is more easily positioned among non-human forms of interaction, communication, or intelligence. Okay, what we have here is 2 mosques. One from 17th century Bukhara, and below it, a page from the famous Topkapi scroll, which came from something like 30-meter collection of drawings like this that come from an architect's workshop, probably late 15th century, that's showing the kind of differentiation that's thought about in the generating of Muqarnas. So it's projected into that vaulted space. This comes from Necipoglu's wonderful treatment of this. And if you want to get a much more detailed background, I heartily encourage you to look at Nader El-Bizri's, where he's here somewhere, translation and commentary on the 9th century epistles of the Brethren of Purity, and the volumes on geometry, on music, and probably on composition and the arts. And this is a mosque in the parliament at Dhaka by Liu Khan, in which these cylinders, whose top you can see here through these windows, are effectively a brise-soleil. Curiously, the whole thing rather has the quality of this. And the mihrab wall is a plaque of wood rather than a niche. And as you can see, it's striated with marble that marks, it was all built by hand, so each one of those is a day of a pour. And those are the only inclined walls in the whole thing. It's up above entry as you get in. Okay, and what you end up with is both of them interpreted as what I'll nickname rhythmic light. The open, fluctuating metaphoricity of involvement creates the appeal to tectonics and their attraction to geometrical figures, as if place is itself a metaphor of meaningful relation. On the one hand, deploying arrangements of stones as a way of measuring the vicissitudes of human finitude against earth and sky is quite primordial. On the other hand, it's weird that people are content to flatten architecture, and therefore an important embodiment of context, to quote, form and space. Indeed, the recent interest in tectonics, such as that of Frampton, may be seen as an effort to rescue architecture from the abstraction of form and space, since one aspect of tectonics is the material qualities and their qualification of embodiment. The other, of course, concerns fabrication, the manner in which elements join together, in which firmitas aspires to dignitas, which is not one of the Vitruvian triad. The attraction of tectonics to geometrical figures arises in the service of mediation, that is, of reconciling the vicissitudes of human existence with what is experienced as a universal order ordained by a single highest deity, as the ultimate meaning of context. It displaces mediation from the primordial mundus sensibilis to the mundus intelligibilis. Cutting an extremely long story very short, and apologies, this originates in the Platonic harmonicatology of books 5 and 6 of the Republic, with its emphasis upon sight and light as modes of participation in the world soul. Hellenistic culture fused optics with geometrical analogia, in Latin proportio ratio, as a basis of what we now call a light metaphysics that's concerned to articulate the movement between divine unity and earthly difference, striving to maintain a continuity through the difference where the difference are partial embodiments of the divine dispensation. Such configurations are obviously most consistently developed in sacred settings. Accordingly, these two mosques participate in this tradition in analogous ways, even if Khan's Kaaba, or cube, actually 1.5 times the size of the real one in Mecca, is refracted through 5 centuries of the development of space in Europe. The recovery of Hellenistic perspectivity made geometry central to the transformation of concrete context into the grand generalization of space. And I should have mentioned when we were talking about Neoplatonism and Aztec representation that what geometry is to our tradition, temporal distinctions are to the Mesoamerican tradition. It's a very different kind of game. At any rate, in this, the mundus intelligibilis was converted into a reality understood as a diversity of concepts. I'm now going across the whole 500 years, encompassing everything from individual psychology to fundamental physics. Itself a concept asking to be justified in experience, space had the effect of making architecture an armature for controlling concept, according to the notion of form, first identified by Conrad Fiedler. As quoting him, the complete intellectualization of all material elements. That is, raising material involvement to the highest level of generalization, a concept, which of course authorized a compositional freedom. In the early days, new forms were expected to be attended upon and perhaps even to create new societies. By the time I got to school, it became a matter of university sophistication, and it was all about modern mannerism and shit like that. Again, we can go on about that. In lieu of space, and conforming to the principle that there is no ontological void, we can begin at the other end and anchor our understanding in the relations of particular involvements. We always find ourselves implicated in a milieu of claims upon our freedom, say Heidegger's Ereignis, and affordances, say from Gibson, claims and affordances. This topography extends from immediate involvements through settings mediating between indoors and outdoors, such as this example taken from Eric's book called Context, which I heartily recommend. Saves me a million slides. It fills out this territory very eloquently, up to urban or rural contexts. There's an important temporal dimension to this phenomenon, pointing to the processual nature of these involvements. For example, the desk is ontologically older than everything else on it, even if we bought the desk yesterday. Similarly, there are varying temporalities attached to these. This is kind of ready to hand immediately. That's, 3 weeks, I need to have the grades back. Those, 6 months ago. But this, is from the 4th century BCE. So quite how those temporal modalities work is actually worth paying attention to. Against almost everyone from Augustine onwards, I hold there's no such thing as space or time in the singular. The spatiality and temporality of a mosquito and a brick have very different characters. A context presents itself as the interaction of myriad concrete embodiments. In other words, the peripheral apprehension of the natural attitude is very deep. In fact, you basically consume architecture in peripheral vision, not like it has it in the mags. And it's the phenomenon of embodiment clearly points to the derived character of subjectivity, since all content is found in the otherness of the extended, distributed topics of the context. The topography of claims and affordance, the context, presents itself to us as an extended embodied distribution of metaphoric involvements. This is the background to the phrase that Dalibor used to quote all the time from Merleau-Ponty: they're protected from delirium or hallucination, not by our critical, I may be overstepping my bounds here. We're all about to go into another dimension. But not by our critical powers, but by the structure of our spatiality. What this also means is that the context is always already intelligent. Not necessarily benign. For a vole, it includes hawks. But this means that the digital simulation of a city or nature, whose protocols we've just been through, requires bringing all this diversity, the mess, the hopes, the lovely design, the neglect, the transport systems, the IT systems, blah, all those conflicts and ambiguities to a single horizon of representation that can be made algorithmic. The city or nature is its own computer, requiring all that mess and so forth. Moreover, this temporality has a structure. Our thoughts move very quickly and drift in and out of focus. Speech moves slightly more slowly, gestures slower still, objects slower even still, the furniture even less, and of course the architecture and the walls even less. The earth moves least of all. This rather mawkish painting is actually quite interesting. There's a whole bunch of them from this period that are involved with Socrates and Alcibiades. This is Aspasia, who is Pericles' wife. That's Pericles, so this must be some ideal version. Pericles' Pallas would never have looked like this. But she's teaching Socrates rhetoric, which Socrates compared to cooking in the Gorgias. And she is dressed, as you see, in the red, white, and blue of the French tricolor, probably. And Alcibiades is dressed in both the earth colors of Socrates and the red, white, and blue of Aspasia, as if to realize that rhetoric, he's an incredibly complicated character. He ended up working for the Persians for a while, and he was probably a lover of Socrates, but basically he was a warrior. That the painter recognized that the agon was like, or that rhetoric was an agon like war. And it's that principle where, and this is the crucial to the Socratic dialogue, where he depends on the other person holding up their end of the dialogue, and the truth emerges, as it were, between them, as something they co-create. This is the whole basis of the fascination for rhetoric and dialogue by, Arendt, Grassi, Gadamer. As a diagram, this looks like the group surrounding the Hegelian stratification with which we started. However, it's oriented to how we participate in the play of a context and is more concerned with process than the content of what is spoken or thought. I would argue that the Hegelian diagram is a consequence of these processes. Although the relation between the strata will always hold, the higher depend on the lower, the strata themselves are quite open and very subject to ambiguity, change, violations of decorum, deception, confusion. This stratification rarely appears in the literature, but it has a significant effect on how we participate in situations, and its character exhibits our obligation to processual immanence. This stratification can be extended into the urban topography as a whole, from the primordial natural conditions up to the rhythmic typicalities of practice of everyday praxis. And I'm not going to get into large block urbanism, which I think we all are familiar with, and its capacity to stimulate interaction across the strata of society, but it's just reassuring to know it can happen even in 21st century Paris. Okay, this opens the second meaning of relation, that inspired by Edouard Glissant's The Poetics of Relation, which invokes the ethical aspects of processual phenomena. The point of departure came from Ulysses, Joyce's Ulysses, as an inspiration for coping with megacities. Jakarta, for example, is 2/3 the population of England on 5% of the area. And along with that, the great disparities of wealth, opportunity, and types of urbanity. Dublin in 1904 had the highest death rate in Europe, and yet Joyce recognized in Dear Dirty Dublin the symbolic embodiment of European civic culture, primarily by acknowledging the constitutive role in urban life of ambiguity, confusion, even violence, along with insight, generosity, and wit. Glissant's relation identifies the dignity and richness of the creoles spoken by peoples marginalized by official culture. In his case, the descendants of slaves in the Antilles, a culture to which I've been introduced by Tao. And Joyce does something similar with the songs and expression of his poor Irishmen, even down to the sounds of Paracelsus. However, Joyce also allows intimations of transcendence, not as official dogma or policy, the viceroy is a fleeting presence, and the Pope can be manifest as a postal pillar box, but as possibilities of the collective imagination. Aquinas and Shakespeare are fellow citizens of Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus. And indeed, it is in the domain of partial or approximate understanding, the condition in which we all subsist, that the movement between the processual and the ontological transpires. Design has consistently sought to do good, as it were, inevitably inviting the question of how good and good for whom. For professional reasons, architects' renders tend to project a rather strange form of happiness, with examples of every minority enjoying the architecture on a summer evening. Similarly, the literature associated with phenomenology and architecture tends to assume a rather peaceful contemplative world, overly concerned with the experience of architecture, such as Zumthor's atmospheres, occasionally straying into somewhat cloying species of piety inspired by late Heidegger, notably Norbert Schultz. Vitruvius characterized the Hellenistic city as two theaters of culture, high and low. Despite 2 centuries of inspiration from, for example, Italian hill towns, we still lack a proper understanding of the comic set and its contribution to urban depth. We might see the common set as the receptacle of the slang expressions argots and creoles, which are so important to Glissant and Joyce. I'm not new to this problem, or we're not new to this problem. It became particularly visible immediately after World War II, where even the UN recognized that Carlo Levi's depiction of the very primitive culture, triple quotes, of these 2 tiny villages in Basilicata, Grassano and Galliano, as he called them, the very south of Italy. His book was called Christ Stopped at Eboli because a train line divides at Eboli and it's still further, it doesn't get to Galliano. Recognized at a much higher dignity than anything retailed by the fascist regime, the Mediterraneità, Romanità. And yet, and numerous architects took this up no less enthusiastically than somebody like Ludovico Quaroni, attempting to add on to Matera, of all places, with what effectively looks like an American suburbia. This is, I mean, as I say, this problem is not new. If Christ never arrived to Grissano or Galliano, he's a constant presence in this Rio favela documented by John Blair, who's, yes, the filmmaker who did the documentary of Eric. It deserves to be placed alongside the more famous films of Pichotte from 1980 and The City of God in 2002 for exhibiting how visceral and intense can be the struggle to make sense of a context. Here, God serves both as vehicle of hope for the evangelical preacher, the police, and the citizens, and a vehicle of guilt for those caught up in the drug economy who constantly resent the world that they themselves are creating and maintaining. Now, this, of course, is not the whole story of life in a favela, which also includes charity, collaboration, and creativity, not all of it legal. I deduce it here for the purposes of trying to establish a kind of scope and depth of urban life, of what cities tell us about being human. And if by this measure, middle-class techno-consumerism represents the other end of the spectrum of this favela, the question arises if our ecologically demanding freedoms are well interpreted. If art is one way to assess the interpretation of freedom, our museums are filled with wonderful artifacts, of which I call that one example, produced by cultures, not in a museum obviously, produced by cultures which endured much lower standards of living than we do, produced, of course, at the behest of princes and priests for the most part. This, of course, invokes the enchanted domain of craft, typically anonymous, at least until the late Middle Ages in Europe. However, if the two images on the right are one way of bracketing the diversity of late capitalist production, and both require craft, at what point do we pass beyond diversity to arrogance? We don't have time for it, but do look up the words to Pon Pon Pon. She's very much admired by Charlie XCX, I'm told. The two images in the middle manifest fragile attempts to articulate basic spatial distinctions, furnishing the iconography of what Donald Trump would no doubt call a shit city. Okay, to conclude, I want to try to sketch out slightly more carefully what's happening at an urban level. I grew up under the regime of figure field, which could really become Mannerist in the generation of Colin Rowe, where what was dark was seen as private, and what was white was seen as public. And to a large extent, that still commands people's idea of what is public realm, which may once have had its locus in, the agora or other ceremonial place, but has now become a kind of flaneurscape amid shopping, entertainment, and eating, or spectacles like the Paris Olympics, and can even be extended to operations like this, a recently installed kind of collar of pedestrian circulation in Shibuya with 6 vertical cores that are, of course, populated with shopping and eating and, half inside, half outside, and even this famous 30-meter-long mural, The Myth of Tomorrow, originally intended for a Mexico hotel. I don't believe that does justice to the nature of public life, that vision of public-private. If we look slightly more carefully, and yes, this is now under a preservation order, though constantly reworked on the inside, each one of these little things is like a little town in its own right. And I think we should distinguish between public and crowd. And what's going on, I see the public as any manifestation of political life, which starts, with two people, can then be extended up to small clubs or groups of that kind, to, workplaces, schools, up to places with some ceremonial or sacred pretension, not forgetting emergency gatherings, when there's a flood or something. Our economic life is largely crowd-like. If the public is the domain, for me, where Freedom 4 manifests itself as something like a potential solidarity or a commitment to the anonymous whole, the crowd, and particularly particular kinds of our notions of our economic life, usually described statistically, promote freedom from, seeing the city basically as a service provider, as kind of infrastructure. This is distinguishing two kinds of economic behavior, both malls. Hong Kong is full of them. Langham Place, a 14-story high mall, basically for shops that can afford the rents. So nothing really handmade there. As against this, in Chungking Mansions, this is one of three, an extraordinary building, and anybody who knows Hong Kong knows this building, with something like 90 tiny hotels in it, named things like Cosmos, for people mostly from Southeast Asia and Africa, arriving with wads of money, trying to buy Chinese goods in Hong Kong to sell in their home countries. But this distinction between a high and low economy as a matter of one's economic life is something that the concrete dimensions of this sort of world is picked out by Abdulmalik Simone, to whom I was introduced by Matthew, who's quite articulate on how the gray economies work in places like Jakarta or Africa, in which they require personal arrangements, either on the phone or actually face-to-face, that involve trust, but also theft, deception, violence, and even sorcerers in Dakar, in contrast to the online world of high finance and big data, which of course is not bereft of crime. And you can run across crossovers. So Paulo Moreira found a woman in the shantytown of Chikala in Luanda, who lived in a house probably twice the size of this table, who was organizing cloth from China and seamstresses in Guatemala off her cell phone. And I heartily encourage getting into things like Banerjee and Duflo, which understand the bottom-up economy. And somebody like Colin McFarlane, perhaps not his introduction, but his examples of how cities learn through practical involvement, from something like how to dupe with toilets to, something that looks more like that as a problem of how a city itself learns about itself. That little spectrum is quite instructive. Mall designers regularly claim that their malls are improved versions of urban street or piazza. However, if the defect of the mall is that the urban life is made into a closed system, generating profit for the investors, figure field thinking obscures the degree to which a street is the result of everything happening behind the facades. Whitechapel High Street, you probably know better than this famous street, the Ramaswamy Street in Kumbakonam. And this is part of, large block urbanism and all of that. And therefore, our capacity to recognize regions in a city that have different styles, different materials, different languages, different foods. And I'm less hard, these are pretty much dissipated now, though you can find, for example, Koreatown in Los Angeles, which is quite an intense and interesting world. I'm more generous to ghettos than people usually are. And the rootedness of all of that kind of thing in the anonymous institutional order of languages, foods, postures, modes of interaction, and the anonymity of these orders, and therefore the basis of a commitment to the remote order of the city. These are all built around coffee in various modalities, basically going from rich to poor. Or simply, that's Mussolini talking to the German ambassador. Okay, to conclude, Gerald Edelman, whom you may know, got a Nobel Award in biology and then turned to neurophysiology, derided AI as a model for human imagination as logic and a clock. I thought was quite astute. He preferred the analogy, and he was actually referring to this painting, of Rousseau's tropical forest. And those of you who are interested might be interested in Eduardo Cohn's How Forests Think. What this tells me is that the mooted Heideggerian clearing in which design as understanding appears in a forest that is processual, as described by Derrida, with all the multifoliate, metamorphosing language that Derrida describes. And if context is an embodied culture, you don't get one without the other. And this helps bring together these two famous quotes. The first from Wittgenstein, our language can be compared to an ancient city. And Heidegger, unfortunately, most of his philosophy develops it implicitly, but he never returned to it explicitly, unfortunately. The city gives nature a definite direction, i.e. that whole city-nature dichotomy that everybody, natural, artificial, and all of that, should be forsworn. The individual, human or animal or thing, is both played by the city or forest, and so from now on I'm talking about these two together as one, as a kind of combined manifestation of what is a context. It contributes to making the urban and ecological life typically through the clusters of praxes that are called assemblages across the spectrum that we called attention to earlier, between conflict, negotiation, accommodation, and collaboration, and always back and forth in any particular circumstance. Context is always already given for events, people, and things, and accordingly, particular contexts defer to the collective context. There's a conforming to Merleau-Ponty's impossibility of an ontological void. The institutional depth structures moral orientation and its modes of expression in the tension between freedom for and freedom from. Incidentally, that choice comes from Nietzsche's Zarathustra, but it doesn't matter. And this calls attention to the interaction of two kinds of depth. One is the sheer extensive depth, the complex topography of embodying conditions for processual metaphoric involvements, and the intensive depth that resides in the communicative or relational order that we pointed to earlier. And it's in this sense that a context is always already intelligent, and that poetics, therefore, engages the ontic processes of constant negotiation of the claims and affordances of the embodying conditions as the matrix for a symbolic city, identifying a shared ethical coherence, i.e. a third kind of freedom, obligation to, or potential obligation to. I hope this has made some sense, and I'm sorry for going on so long. Thank you very much for sitting through it. Please do let me know.
Thank you hugely, Peter. There's a lot to unpack, if I can say that. So we've got a mic, and it's open to the floor to
There's a couple of mics.
start to do so. Any questions?
Thank you, Peter.
This is Nader El-Bizri, by the way.
I'm returning to the notion of depth and tie it to this impossibility of ontological void in Merleau-Ponty. So
Yeah.
the notion of depth is la profondeur.
It's amazing how this is
Right?
echoing.
Yeah,
I'm
so-
getting you.
And when he talks about profondeur, it is particularly tied to my position in the way I observe things around me. So it is not something that would involve a third person. And this is
How do you mean involve a third person?
meaning that it is intrinsically connected with my embodied situational position and my ocular motor kinesthetic.
Okay.
And that becomes intimately tied to the manner, the meaning that arises from the visual perceptual field becomes also mine. And this is something that is not only
I don't
in
know if it's
phenomenology.
yours so much as you participate in it.
Um,
As I say, you are the background to everybody else's, or part of the background to everybody else's context.
That's where context comes, yeah.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it is something that now it's being picked up by the analytic tradition as a kind of problematizing the phenomenological discourse in terms of what qualia mean. A raw field that is intrinsically mine in the first person that cannot be shared with a third person. Because I could share it with you in terms of pointing at things, and we might think that we have a shared meaning. But that gap has not been totally solved. And this is the hard problem of consciousness.
Yes, I'm familiar with this problem, yes.
If I want to take it to the deeper roots, it comes also from the perspectiva tradition. It places us in a situation that somehow tries to project the position of the observer through perspectival geometrization. And this is something that is Albertian. While if we take Ghiberti's side, it's still tied to the psychological aspects of vision. Therefore, what I see are intentions. And intentions involve my first-person experience in detecting meaning, even though there is context. And that's where, you could take it even further into the Derridian realm, where meaning itself becomes splintered, becomes something that is continually renegotiated. So,
Of course.
that's where I'm trying to bring more the problems that you have highlighted in terms of tying depth to the ontological void, to perspectiva, and the deconstruction of meaning.
Yes, it's long been a contention, particularly the processualists, that there's no such thing as depth. That it's all happening. One of the favorite analogies is surface. I think logic doesn't have the privileged position it claims for itself. I think it's a special form of analogy, and that comes from the messy world that we inhabit. And what's instructive to me about what we might call the processual milieu conjured by Deleuze or Derrida is that helps characterize the messy world of which we're part. Phenomenology isn't very good on violence, on error, on lack of comprehension. It tends to spend a lot of its time trying to understand, a table or that kind of thing. Merleau-Ponty, of course, used aphasias, and that's one way into it, where it overlaps with something like psychology. Again, I think psychology has lost the soul. It's become a property of mentation, therefore something that can be compared to computation or the processing of algorithms. Now, I'm not going to convert everybody into Christianity or something like that, but that notion that we are always already part of a world that's bigger than us is what's contained in soul that's interesting, at least for the minimal condition of what this represents, and therefore allows me to work back and forth between let's call it the iconographic aspects of mathematics or geometry, or in the Mesoamerican case, temporality, and concrete life or ordering schema, which I simply don't, as I say, accord the higher status to. The word system to me is almost like a contradiction in terms. I can see where you can use them, and I can see the grossest possible sense that, you got input, system, output, and that could describe almost anything. But the degree to which system is mechanical or logical or looks, like Descartes, one of the famous critiques of representational thinking is to call it a Cartesian theater. I would turn that upside down and, as I say, see the logic as a way to try to secure a kind of reality that you really have to leave your own reality behind in order to obey. And maybe we're saying the same thing, but I'm trying to set that when I was talking, and it went much too quickly, and I was moving back and forth between tectonics and geometrical orders, and a speculative geometric order, such as the motif of identity and difference in the Mujarnes. I was trying to suggest that's kind of a way of living with geometry, as it were, that doesn't mean that geometry is determinative as what's meaning. Now, if one dwells automatically in the qualias, you may think you can't make any sense, but obviously it's a sense even a dog can make. And so that's the stratum which has to be respected. That's where one has to start. I don't find the qualia stranded. I mean, this obviously violates a lot of Western logic, Islamic logic as well, which has the same roots. But I don't know, anyway, this.
Thank you. Another question.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was absolutely wonderful as ever. I think for me, one of the most interesting things that you said was this contrast between a sort of temporal order of, life, the Mesoamerican one, and the spatial one that we have. And it made me reflect, and I'm really, really sorry to bring up the most horrendous human in the world at the moment, but the orange blob, a couple of days ago, issued this weird document that appears to be about to change the whole world order, namely the new American defense strategy, which says that everything that China and Russia are doing is fine. South America belongs to America, and Europe's finished, largely. And it's been really bugging me, obviously where this is coming from is a sort of horrendous political offshoot of a whole series of inherited ideas that are now snowballing. I mean, the reason that Europe is finished is because we don't have Elon Musk, basically. In other words, we have failed to sort of keep up pace with the next sort of amazing technological evolution that's meant to sort of transform life. And I guess my question, such as it is, and I'm obviously making this up as I go along, is that everything you're talking about, which I think we intuitively value, which is to do with dwelling in a place and dwelling being a subset of time. In other words, you can't dwell if you don't actually have the time to do it. And the kinds of spaces that evolve out of, if you like, Dalibor's sort of, typical situations, the cafe table or your desk or, those very evocative situations that we know. I mean, is there some way that we can use a sort of argument for this kind of freedom for? I mean, I think freedom for is what Europe needs to argue for, as it were, as a riposte to this monstrousness coming out of the White House. But, could it be something to do with a sort of, the dignity of what it means to be human that gets articulated as a sort of an inheritance that all of us share, even though it's invisible? It's made invisible in certain cultures because it's being dismissed as what everyone did yesterday. I mean, I'm just...
The way those guys try to mobilize God For the sake of this, I mean, it reminds me of the poor, unfortunate characters, the drug lords in John Blair's documentary. He becomes sort of Christus militans, but without much Christus. I mean, there's no question that we could boil ourselves to death by just following Donald Trump to the abyss. And he's able to kind of get his way. I mean, in terms of a basic taste, his ballroom can stand for, and Mara logo, I mean, you just can't believe it. At any rate, he can get his way because he's got a lot of bombs and he's got a lot of AI, which he thinks is going to run the show. And those are things that can be negotiated, can be turned into deals. And he attaches the rest to it based on that power. That he understands the context is obviously not there. But it indicates how, I mean, look at what happened during the Nazi and fascist regimes. They transformed the Western tradition into stuff that could be enforced by thugs.
Yeah.
A series of attributes. Do you qualify? No, you've got the wrong color hair.
I guess what I was trying to drive at was the different perception of time, because his perception of time seems to be the new thing is always better than the thing that went before. We invent our way out of trouble. It's this sort of technological view. Whereas actually what you were talking about, the time of a brick as opposed to the time of a gnat, is what Europe actually embodies. And of course he can't, wait to get over and sort of be in Windsor Castle and have all of that. In other words, it's a sort of, it's not something that we articulate very well, I guess is what I was trying to say.
I don't think he's going to be persuaded. I mean, I think the defect is from here up, probably, and here down, probably.
I guess I also assume he's a lost cause.
Yeah, the idea of trying to, and people like Vance, who are supposedly the intellectuals of that operation, he's probably worse because he's much more dogmatic and he thinks he's got reasons. Like, what's his name? The poor guy who just got killed. Kirk. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Any rate, I mean, at least Kirk believed in debate. And so, there's something to be said for that. And the idea that the world will, that we will see anything of this better world before the water's up to here is, a hope. I mean, I think enough people share a kind of ethical vision that maybe at some point things will begin to happen. I mean, it's amazing how, on the one hand, the regrets over World War II within like 5 years turned into global consumption in the American style. And it's just all of that ethical responsibility that everybody voiced at the end of the world just went under the bus, under the consumerist bus. And, people have been, there's been so many experiments in philosophy and psychology, and, anybody ill who goes into the web can get cured. Good luck to them. So that the idea that we can live among so many cultures and thrive is something, something of a miracle that we get this far. Whether it'll last or whether it'll get better is, of course, a real question. Sorry, Matthew.
Matthew. Yeah.
Hi, thanks, Peter. I wanted to go back to the what you were saying in relation to public space, civic life, and you were reflecting on the figure ground moving forward. Mm-hmm. And you particularly said, we need to draw attention, we need to concern ourselves with the crowd. The phrase you had, I took a note of it as concrete and abstract exchange of goods and information. And I was just thinking here really also about the crowd, but also questions of density of people, connectivity, the metabolism of how those crowds work. especially when, well, in relation to this, the social dynamics of that metabolism. And really coming back to infrastructure, so the questions of physical, technological and cultural infrastructure are part of that nature of the crowd, particularly how infrastructure can operate when the physical infrastructure is not there, always failing, and then it might vary across different contexts.
Yeah, I mean, the part that interests me is this spectrum of public in which all that's political or social can happen. And any action of that kind introduced into, as it were, the flow of the crowd, interrupts the crowd. Everybody depends on the crowd being like the tube system, or like getting into a football match, or something like that. I.e., it's a kind of mass phenomenon best described statistically. And there's no, I mean, when you look at something like Jakarta, and you kind of explore all of its byways, and you see, right, there's bits of Dubai marching down the middle, and there's a lot of Dharavi, and extending from horizon to horizon. It's not quite as extreme as Dharavi, but at any rate, far from it. At any rate, what is how does one understand that broad texture? I understand what Dubai does, but it's that broad texture that really interests me, because that is it looks mass-like, particularly from the air, and it's certainly treated that way by the folks who run Jakarta. They have no choice. They kind of, they see it all as statistics that they have to manage. But the people who live it in concrete enclaves, they may be doing business. They may go up to the docks once every 2 weeks to pull something off the back of a lorry that nobody else sees, and then go back and retail it in where they live. And there may be groups, and you find out Abdul Malik Simone is very good on how people develop networks that often overlap. People learn to steer clear of each other. People learn to collaborate or not.
And I think that when you referenced Abdul Malik Simone, I was thinking particularly he wrote an article, People as Infrastructure, and part of what he was saying is that there is capacity, especially in those neighborhoods where there isn't that physical separation, to get by and to create that strength in a crowd through its capacity for intelligence as a kind of a density that ebbs and flows.
Yeah. With more time, I think it would have been worthwhile to spend much more time on that. And people like Mike and Helen have been practicing it.
Good evening. I'd like to speak. The last time I saw Peter, we'd just come from King's College Chapel, where we heard a lecture from the Sudan emergency rooms, which is a most amazing institution that got born out of this horrible conflict, which you probably all read about. And what's most extraordinary is that there's a tradition in Sudan of eating, common eating together, which is very ancient. And so people commonly come together, and if you're walking down the street and there's food, someone will invite you to sit with them and eat. And from this very simple institution, when the conflict started, each community had no access to food, no access to water, no access to medicine. So they formed these emergency rooms and started interacting as a group. But they had the benefit of technology and the benefit of WhatsApp and the benefit of Bangkok, which meant that you could get money from New York to a village somewhere in the most remote parts of Darfur and feed a group of people for a week. And that's entirely came together in a magical way. And it's formed itself into these institutions that keep on running. And the whole country, it's 45 million people, have no access to huge quantities of food and water, but through the normal ways. But through this community, very simple, from Carolyn's food thesis, just the action of eating together has evolved into this enormous system web, which has allowed a society to survive and thrived. And from our work, we've been doing things which we never imagined we could do because these communities are still coming together. So I can't really speak from what Peter's talked about. I can show you an example, or you can go and see for yourself, or you can read about it. of how societies can reform themselves after they've been completely annihilated and come from an organic source, from their own sense of their own being. And how that in their society they have this sharing, it's a system of sharing. Anyhow, so that's all I would like to say as an example.
No. That's the.
Thank you very much for your lecture, Peter. I really enjoyed it. You may have heard the Rutger Bregman Wreath lectures.
Oh yes.
Calling for a moral revolution. I mean, going back to what Carolyn's kind of talking about, the contemporary situation. It's interesting that there is obviously a move to kind of reconsider the whole kind of nature of what morality actually is in this world that we're facing. But the thing that I find deeply troubling about Bregman is that he conveniently avoids the question of context and the issue of what constitutes our ecological dimension of life, of existing coexistence in the environment, in the world around us. He just sidesteps that issue.
Yes, he tends to believe in kind of charismatic, Christ-like figures.
Absolutely.
As the way to crystallize the new understanding. I mean, he's got a lot of nice ideas.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. But it reminds me, when you talk about the relationship between the crowd and the notion of the public realm, if you like, the public existence.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out a better way of understanding public realm.
Yeah.
Because I'd say at the moment, public realm tends to be crowd-like.
Yeah.
And I think the public realm is pervasive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But it reminds me of, I don't know whether you know George Agamben's book, The Kingdom and the Garden.
Yeah.
Which conveys the whole kind of question, explores the whole issue about what is kind of human nature in the context of sin and grace. And he explores it through three: sin
and grace.
And grace,
okay.
yeah. And he starts basically with St. Augustine's, the concept of original sin, basically. You know, that we're excluded from the paradise. We're excluded from paradise. It's kind of closed off. We no longer have access to it. But then he actually explores two other thinkers, but basically Dante, particularly De Monarchia. And also he looks at John Scotus, Erigena, and the way in which John Scotus actually turns the whole idea of original sin on its head. And he basically says that human nature is untouched by sin, which completely contradicts what St. Augustine is saying, that human nature is something that we all share, that sin exists outside, or the idea of the fall exists outside our sense of what constitutes human nature. It's the baseline upon which we all exist. Our human nature is something which is inextricably part of the natural order, and that never goes. It's basically what Erigena is actually arguing. And I think there's something really powerful about that argument, the idea of the corruption of human nature, which is what St. Augustine's actually arguing. This is what even Dante, in a sense, in De Monarchia kind of challenges. But I'm interested in what your thoughts are about this question of human nature in the context of the technocratic world that we're in. What does that actually mean?
I certainly think that we are eccentric to the deity, whoever he or she is. Whether sin is the right way to describe that is a real question. The degree to which human finitude is a natural condition is also part of why I began wondering if subjectivity isn't a derived condition, in the way that one looks at an ecology as a kind of something that we're not part of except when we need a being, one imagines that the hawk doesn't enjoy the landscape. It's really looking for voles. It's not a landscape painter. And the extent to which you're eccentric, or simply part of these larger processes, is the kind of thing that's coming out of large data and so forth. It's what they do with it that's the problem, and how they get it. And then instead of allowing it to build as a city, they want to represent it as data. as something that can be controlled algorithmically, and certainly by people, and possibly by Peter Thiel, if possible. And that's all of that's pretty scary shit. I think from day one there's a lot of talk of responsibility, but if you just go through the Industrial Revolution, people were going on and on about responsibility from day one, and that never wins. It always ends up being shrouded in regret or frustration and sadness. At the same time, I'll answer the phone if it rings. I use a toilet. I use an electric oven to bake bread in, so forth. And is there a degree of commitment or selling your soul? Or, you don't get a lot of credit for living off grid. And you end up being the Unabomber. But where the level is a tricky question. I mean, if you go into the World Wildlife Fund and see countries, I can't find cities. Bolivia is the same amount in as out, i.e. they're actually they're not demanding too much from the environment. Needless to say, anything in the US or Europe is way up here in terms of overextending, using the people who are under. I mean, the whole of Dharavi uses less water in a year than, I can't remember its name, the famous five-star hotel in Mumbai uses in something like a month. Yes, the Taj, that's right. Yeah. And how you square those kind of differences without going in and turning off taps. Maybe you charge a lot for, here we get into the tactics and the practical aspects. We're dealing with stuff that we really are in over our heads in terms of how it operates. And it's not like it's a policy. It's like a way of life. It's not like you can go to Congress and say, do this. Make all cars, they try over and over again. And, it sort of goes forward and back. But I think that kind of halfway world, I think it's patronizing to get high-minded with people. At the same time, it's extraordinary how collectively we have such difficulty with collective ethical questions.
Thanks, Peter. Really, really, really enjoyable. A lot to think about. But I was interested in the Wittgenstein and Heidegger quotations, which almost have a sort of a Latin chiasmus version of reversal. And that sort of is making me think, because one of the words you didn't use very much was one that Nick's just used, which is ecology, and the relationship between effectively nature and the city and the way in which one could have a natural or an urban ecology. And I wondered, it feels like at the moment many people are talking about civilization shifting or moving, and whilst the answers have come in the past from the city, I wonder if the problems are now emerging from the city, and whether in fact what do the cities also hold the future for the positive future?
One would hope. Civilization is a word people think of as naughty, but I would say, one of what I meant by Earth and that stratification of temporalities is effectively ecology. What you see even from Erigena, going all the way back to ancient cosmologies, is that human life is secondary to the primary given order, which is usually identified with the gods. But that primary given order, ecological, natural, nature with a capital N, And the Heidegger comment is that we are extensions of that. I mean, every piece of technology starts with raw materials that are natural. They may not end up looking like the Parthenon, they look more like my cell phone. But, I mean, and the thing about the cell phone is it's interesting where the technology bites. It bites at ease of use. It says, you don't have to do the work. You don't have to carry the water anymore. I can pump it to you. I mean, a cell phone is basically a medieval manuscript with animations. All the sophistication lies in the phone and the communication. That's the part, of course, where you make all the money. And the extent to which that's rooted in everyday conversation, face-to-face conversation, is interesting, because it is and it isn't. Obviously, it is initially the question of the autonomy of the book, of the text, and all of that stuff filters through this. But it's the degree to which it's simply more text, or more images, and it's a kind of cascade of stuff that veers between profundity and crap, with a heavy emphasis. And the way it's delivered as a kind of magic light that doesn't cost anything gives it an air of empowerment that it doesn't justifiably deserve. And that happens over and over again in technology, is that it makes something easy, right? And all the costs are hidden. The idea is that you get what you want by pushing a button. All the infrastructure that is required to get that button to do its job is hidden. And that is not part of how the technology is understood. I mean, somebody like Kittler tries to develop a kind of quasi-philosophy around technology that's not uninteresting, but I think it misses the point of how we kind of resent it but make ourselves indebted to it, and how we're perfectly comfortable living with it in this ambiguous state of being grateful for its ease and guilty at the same time. Should we be living like a favela? Is that what's ecologically sustainable? Where everything is hand to hand and fraught with, you and I having to do business in the street sort of thing, over a coffee. And all of that's very open. I mean, the idea that somebody's got a solution to that is naive. I mean, I've read through a number of them. There's certainly a number I haven't read through, and that may be that the golden one lies out there. I mean, they go back, visions of a kind of ideal order, that it would be done like Plato through the exhibition of truth, and that would, as it were, trickle down to the fractious polis, all the way to just being a tyrant, or saying, no, I'm going to be selfish. I'm only here for, so many years, and I'm going to have a good time. I mean, and all of those are very difficult positions by which to understand what can happen collectively. I mean, the way Marxism, ecology is a big deal in Marx himself. When it becomes Marxism, and some of it in Europe particularly was more interesting than what actually happened in Russia. It certainly became an ism that could be enforced in Russia. In Italy, it was much more alive and dialogical. I mean, the primary speakers would be the most famous comedians who were very witty, and they weren't just telling one-liners. It was all about life in Italy. And that kind of spirit, and it went from the kids up to grand folks and so forth. And that mode of engagement, that kind of play, was one of the few times when I said to myself, politics actually has something going to it. I mean, I grew up in America where, the cereal box is more nourishing than the cereal. And, everything is run off advertising, which is what Hitler learned about America, how to do propaganda. And this was very concrete, very open, and, it got compromised by the strategia del tensione, actually in the time that I was there, in the 70s, where Moro got killed. So nothing lasts forever. I mean, Peter Hall wrote a short little article trying to identify how cities became creative. And he identified three kinds of creativity, one of which is artistic creativity, one of which I would call innovation. He means technological creativity. And the third was cities making themselves better, which is the part of this that I'm most interested in. And he says, you know, like London in the 19th century, whatever you think of Victorians, really had public life as a concern. I mean, those cities that were built up north had a vision of public life that was quite rich and coherent, certainly by comparison to laissez-faire capitalism. Yes, it had its exclusions, and, you know, if you were gay, you didn't come out of the closet, and so on and so forth. If you were a woman, you led a fairly hard life. Though, of course, it's out of that matrix that the vote, okay, blah, blah, blah. And the bits of how to understand oneself historically as part of these processes, because you're part of some and not part of others. And what are the ones that you have in common that are actually mostly very anonymous, that have to do with kind of, you know, the way we gather, the way we have coffee together or whatever. So at any rate, in terms of concrete praxis, what do they call them? It's like the word reunion, but it isn't that, of the Italian Communist Party in the 70s is the upper end of my experience. But I would completely agree with you that one's always reinterpreting the natural conditions in which one finds one. We are, after all, part animal, probably more animal than God, to be honest.
I think, no, it's perfect. I think in praise of difficulty is a very nice idea that has, you know, kind of developed at all sorts of levels in what you've talked about. But actually, thank you massively. I think there's an informality to a drink and something to eat and conversation around that. And thanks for everyone for coming. Brilliant, Peter.
Well, thank
all
you.
that time.
Thank you. Yeah, that's that.